and things such as extremism and managing implicit bias, right? And also when we do research into hate groups, oftentimes it's law enforcement that comes to us to say, what do you know about this hate group? What do you know about this individual? What information that you can share? So we do a lot of different education. And then finally, advocacy. I know the word lobbying, not a very popular term in American language. Completely get it. But the kind of lobbying that we do is to fight hate. So some examples are in Illinois, for instance, we are actually advocating for an anti-doxing bill. If you don't know what doxing is, it's essentially a form of attacking somebody by sharing all their personal information out in the public. We're actually working in Illinois now to make that illegal and make it a civil crime so people can sue an individual or an organization that commits doxing. We also promote hate crime, anti-hate crime legislation, mandating Holocaust education, I'll get into that here shortly, and also something called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. That sounds super boring and bureaucratic, I get it, but it's actually a very important program. It provides grants to houses of worship, right, like Shalom, to provide security, right, and it's not just synagogues, but it's also churches and mosques, any house of worship, right. That program has been able to fund literally tens of millions of dollars each year to houses of worship to keep them safe, to prevent things like Colleyville and the Tree of Life massacre that have happened in the last 5 years. That's the kind of advocacy that we do at ADL. So like I said, we do way more than lawsuits, right? We do a lot of investigation, a lot of education, a lot of advocacy work. Last concept that I wanted to get into before we get into anti-Semitism. And so when we talk about education, there's a concept ADL created a number of years ago called the Pyramid of Hate. And it's a theoretical concept that we explain to kids, teens, and adults to explain what is hate and how does it manifest, right? One of the things that we teach, especially when I go to non-Jewish audiences, for instance, right, with Yom HaShoah being tomorrow, the Nazis didn't go to bed one night being tolerant of Jews and then wake up the next day and say, let's start the Holocaust. Hate manifested. Hate grew, right? And if left unchecked, as this pyramid indicates, if certain things are left unchecked and you move up the pyramid, the level of hate becomes more radical. It becomes more life-threatening, right? So at the very bottom of the pyramid, you have acts of bias. This is stereotyping. This is prejudice, right? Very common forms that exist. You work your way up, you go to acts of prejudice. So now people are not only thinking and feeling certain things about other groups of people, now they're starting to act on it in individual cases, right? If that becomes normalized, then you'll move up to acts of discrimination. Oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes government-sponsored. These are things like segregation, political disenfranchisement, right? Saying this group of people shouldn't be allowed to live in this neighborhood. This group of people shouldn't be allowed to go to this school district. This group of people shouldn't be allowed to vote. When that becomes normalized, you then go into acts of biased violence. So things like arson, things like murder, things like vandalism, pogroms, perfect example. In the most extreme form, if that becomes normalized in society, is of course then genocide. It's the idea that it's not enough to just terrorize people. This group of people, they are so dangerous or they are so counter to society, we have to get rid of them. The reason why I mentioned this idea, like I said, we use this in schools, we educate this for adults, is that the two reports I'm going to show you, the first one talks more about acts of bias, so prejudice and stereotyping, what people are thinking. And the audit will talk more as you go up the level of acts of prejudice and then actually even violence taking place here in the United States. All right. So, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, so back in January, ADL published a report called Anti-Semitic Attitudes in the United States. This is a report that ADL does every 3 to 4 years. And actually, we've done this report going back to the 1960s. And I would argue, this is a little bit biased, we do our audit every single year, very, very important. I would argue this one is actually more important than the audit that we publish every year, because now we're not looking at anti-Semitic acts. This report looks and surveys, what do Americans think about us as Jews? What do they feel about Jews? What stereotypes are people still holding about our community? So this report was published back in January, and just a little bit of background before I share the results with you. So this was actually done in partnership with the National Opinion Research Institute at the University of Chicago. The reason why I mention that is NORAC is the same organization that will work with NASA. They've worked with the New York Times. They've worked with several government agencies. I'm not a political scientist or a social scientist, but I understand they're basically the gold standard when it comes to research. They're the best of the best at what they do. And we partnered with them to do this survey. We surveyed 4,000 participants nationwide. And we participated, it was an anonymous survey, and it was done online. So like I said, not a statistics expert, but usually most surveys that you see on TV maybe have 500 people, maybe 1,000. We polled 4,000 individuals nationwide. This is a big sample size. This survey was given in September and October of last year, so these numbers are very, very new. And I point that out because this was before the whole Ye, Kanye West, Kyrie Irving instances that happened late last fall. So the survey was done before all that stuff happened. Participants were given various statements, and they were asked, do you agree with these statements or do you disagree with them about Jewish people? And here's the most important point before I show the results. We got rid of the don't know, unsure option on the survey. And we did that for a specific reason. If I were giving a survey, for instance, about fact-based information, right? So can you name the capitals of the United States? And if you didn't know what the capital of Rhode Island was, perfectly okay to say don't know, unsure, right? You don't know. But we're talking not about fact-based information, we're talking about opinions. What do you really think? And one of the things that we realized in our Center of Anti-Semitism Research that did this survey was oftentimes people will say don't know, unsure as a way to say, I don't really want to admit that I'm biased. I don't want to admit that I'm prejudiced, right? So we put people's feet to the fire. We asked them, what do you really think about Jews at the end of the day? So we got rid of that option. Give you an idea. So we asked actually about 11 different statements. These are the same 11 that we have asked going back to the 1960s. Wanted to give you a sample of 4 or 5 of those statements that we asked. So we asked individuals, do you agree or disagree that Jews don't care about what happens to anybody but their own kind? Basically saying that we're clannish, that we're esoteric. We asked people, Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street, right? That stereotype that we are money hungry and powerful now to take over the world. Same idea, Jews have too much power in the United States today. We asked, Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. This is the concept of dual loyalty, questioning our allegiance as Americans. And then last question was, Israel gets away with anything because its supporters control the media. All right? So not even getting into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you think that essentially Jews control the media and therefore we back Israel? Okay. The next slide I'm going to show you shows you the percentages of Americans who either fully agreed or at least partly agreed with those statements. So giving that information, right? 1 out of 5 Americans agreed, at least slightly, Jews don't care about anybody but their own kind. That we're clannish, right? That we stick together, that we don't care about anybody else. Quarter believe that, at least partly agreed, we have way too much control on Wall Street. Way too money hungry, right? Way too obsessed with money and finance. 20% agreed that Jews, at least partly agreed, that Jews have too much power in the United States today. Or way too influential. Number 4 shocked the heck out of me, I can tell you that. Almost 40% agreed, at least partly, that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States. Even though Jews have been part of American history even before our founding, and Jews serve in a number of social services, military, law enforcement, firefighters. We've served in every American war. We've given millions of dollars and millions of hours to nonprofit organizations outside the Jewish community, and yet there's still Americans that question where our allegiance really lies. And the last one I know got cut off there at the ADL logo, but it was actually 21 to 22% that said Israel gets away with anything because we control the media. Like I said, we have been doing this survey going back to the 1960s, right? And we've asked these same 11 questions over and over again, going back 60 years. One of the reasons I'm here today to explain to you, not just to scare you, but to say that yes, anti-Semitism is on the rise. It is not anecdotal evidence. We know that prejudice and stereotypes are now on the rise. And as you can see in the graphic, in 1964, about 1/3 of Americans held anti-Semitic beliefs. That number went down, and it went back up, and we saw in the early 2010s the number started going back down. Based on our survey, so out of the 11 statements that we ask individuals, if somebody were to answer yes or agree to 6 out of the 11, so the majority of those statements. Now, we don't put labels on people at ADL. We're not in the business of calling people anti-Semites. But if you agree with 6 out of 11 of those statements, you're probably anti-Semitic, right? And based on our results, on the 4,000 people that we surveyed, very big sample size for the American public, 20% of people agreed, at least partly, with 6 out of the 11 statements. So when ADL, when we're going on national media and we're making reports and I'm doing presentations like this all across the country, right, we're telling people it's not just anecdotal. Stereotyping is going up in the United States. Prejudice is going up in the United States. Okay. So that's the first report. Second report goes into our anti-Semitic audit. Okay. So the first report looked at prejudice stereotyping, right? So going back to the pyramid of hate idea, kind of that base level, right? Acts of bias, acts of thoughts. I want to go into next of people who are actually acting now on their anti-Semitism. Our anti-Semitic audit is something that we produce every spring. We've done it since 1979. The numbers I'm about to show you show from calendar year last year, so looking at 2022. First, what is considered an incident when we say audit of anti-Semitic incidences? There are 3 specific acts that we look at in this report. We look at harassment, we look at vandalism, and we look at assault. Right? So compared to the first report, this isn't just people thinking things or feeling things about Jews. Now they're acting on it. So the 3 things that we look at: harassment, vandalism, and assault. We have been doing this audit since 1979, for 45 years. Okay. 2022 was now the 3rd time in the last 5 years that we hit all-time high numbers of anti-Semitic acts in the United States. In looking at the numbers going back to 2013, it was not always this way. We saw relatively low numbers of anti-Semitic acts up until about 2015, 2016. And since the numbers have been going up and up and up, the point now nationwide, we recorded and confirmed 3,700 acts of anti-Semitism, of harassment, of vandalism, or assault in the United States. To put that another way, that's roughly 10 anti-Semitic acts per day in the United States. And oftentimes people ask me, well, Trent, is it happening in the Midwest? Is it happening in places that don't have large Jewish populations? Is it happening on the coasts that have large Jewish populations? And my answer is yes, all the above. So I know you can't see the numbers very well, but if you look at the colors, the states that are colored in dark blue or blue are the states that had the highest number of anti-Semitic acts. And when looking at the map, you will see, understandably so, California and New York and Florida, the 3 states that have the large Jewish populations, they're seeing large numbers of anti-Semitism. But you're also seeing large numbers in Texas. You're seeing large numbers in Minnesota. You're seeing large numbers in Georgia as well, too. All right. So like I said, oftentimes people ask me, is it in large Jewish areas? Is it in the American South? Is it in the Pacific Northwest? It's all over, unfortunately. It's the million-dollar question. Usually I can look out in the crowd and I can see people are asking themselves, like, what is going on right now? Why are we seeing the rise, right? So why is this happening? The simple answer we have at ADL is there's not a simple answer. I wish there was, trust me, it'd make our lives a lot easier at ADL. We could throw all of our resources and time into this issue and bring numbers back down to where they were 10 years ago. But ADL, we think it's one of 3 things or a combination of 3 things happening. Okay? So number 1, looking at the political and social environment in the United States. Regardless of wherever you fall politically, religion, socioeconomic status, where you live in the country, I think we can all agree America's had a rough go of it the last 6-7 years in the United States. Right? We've had 2 very controversial presidential elections that were very heated. We had a recession in 2020. We are now experiencing the highest amount of inflation in 40 years in the United States. And most economists would agree we're probably going to go back into a recession sometime this year. And then, of course, the one thing, as I look in the crowd, I don't see any masks on, but that thing called COVID, right? It's the worst pandemic that very, very few Americans were alive when they remember the last one in 1919, right? So you mix all that together, right? So from a political standpoint, economic standpoint, medical standpoint, social standpoint, there's been a lot of tension in the United States. And with that, there are a lot of people who are afraid, and there are a lot of people who are angry, and a lot of people who are scared, right? And when you mix all that together, and I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but there's something to be said as in a human nature that when it feels like society is falling apart, or when it's been a rough go, we have this knee-jerk reaction as humans, we have to blame somebody. Has to be somebody's fault I lost my job. Has to be somebody's fault that the economy shut down with COVID and we're all forced to stay home. Has to be somebody's fault that the inflation rate's at 7-8% and I can't buy eggs like I could 2 years ago, all right? And oftentimes when people are looking for scapegoats, right, they're looking for groups to blame, one of the phrases we have at ADL is called the canary in the coal mine. And one of the first groups throughout history that have been blamed for everything from war to natural disasters to floods to everything in between are us, or Jews. And not too far afterwards are people of color and immigrants and the poor and people of various sexual orientations. It's the other, right? So people that don't fit really into our society. It's the minorities. It's their fault that all these things are taking place. That's part of the problem. Second part of the problem, looking at the internet and social media. It's amazing to think about 20 years ago, for those that are familiar with Facebook, right? It's become a name brand object, right? 20 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was still studying at Harvard University. Facebook was this kind of like college thing that people were using. And now it's all over the place. And it's not just Facebook, it's Twitter, and it's Snapchat, and it's TikTok, and all kinds of other social media, right? Now, with any new technology, it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but how it's being used, right? And one of the things that we notice is that social media is great. We can connect with people all across the world in a matter of seconds. The problem is you have hate groups and extremists who are also using social media to spread their vile and their filth. And a lot of social media companies are really not taking the due diligence to remove that content from their websites. So you have literally people who, a random person in the middle of Iowa can type something into Facebook or TikTok and send it out. You could literally get to millions of people in a matter of seconds. We saw that with the Ye Kanye West incident, right? You can write anything possibly, right, on Twitter or whatever social media company you're at. Kanye West, Ye, had 30 million followers when that event took place in the fall. Can you imagine getting your message out like that to 30 million people? Right? That's double the amount of the entire world Jewish population. So we're seeing this advent of this new technology that we're still not quite sure, should it be regulated? Is it being regulated? What's being allowed, what's not being allowed, et cetera. And the third one, ignorance. It's amazing to think, especially when I do these presentations in the Chicagoland area, I think a lot of people who live in Chicago take it for granted that there's a large Jewish population in that city, as people I imagine in New York, in LA, or South Florida, right? It's when I come to smaller cities like Milwaukee or Indianapolis, where I'm from, where I'll talk to people and they know exactly what I'm talking about when they're the only Jewish person in the neighborhood. Their Jewish child is the only Jewish child that goes to their public school. They're the only Jewish person at their place of employment, right? We forget that as Jews, we make up about 2% of the American population. And it's kind of crazy to think when we get outside of our bubble and we go out to wider America, there are still literally probably millions of Americans who have never met a Jewish person before. And what they have to go off of is what they've seen on TV or movies or social media now. You know, those perceptions are not good. There's nobody there to counter them, to say that's actually not what it means to be Jewish. That's not a real description of what it means to be Jewish in America. All right, so to answer the question, there isn't a simple answer, but we think it's one of these three combinations taking place right now. And then last slide, how you can help. Being a partner synagogue as well as the wider Jewish community, what can we do to stem this kind of rise of anti-Semitism taking place? So we have a few simple asks, right? So number one, reporting incidences, either to our partner Milwaukee Jewish Federation or JCRC, reporting to us, going to the police. If you see an act of hate, not just anti-Semitism, but hate in general, if you see an act of hate or bias taking place, report it. So when we look at the numbers, the anti-Semitic audit that I just showed you a couple minutes ago, those numbers come from people who report to the police, or people who report directly to ADL, or report to JCRCs, our partners. We want to make sure we have the most accurate data possible. right? So that 3,700 number that I showed you, those are just confirmed cases. I would guarantee that number is a lot higher, because we know that victims of hate crimes largely do not report what has taken place, right? But we want to give the most accurate numbers possible to know what is the real situation taking place right now with anti-Semitism. So if you see something, to report something to police, local JCRC, to ADL. Number 2, introductions to K through 12 schools for our anti-hate programming. All right, so I think Brian had mentioned earlier, I came here in the fall and I do a training program called Words to Action. It's geared specifically for Jewish teens in addressing anti-Semitism. But like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we are an anti-hate organization. We have programs like No Place for Hate. We have programs like A World of Difference that looks at anti-bullying and anti-bias. We also have a program called Echoes and Reflections that will educate teachers on how to teach about the Holocaust properly. All right? We would love introductions to schools. If you yourself are a teacher, if you know educators, right? If you know friends or family who are school admin or educators, these programs are largely free. We'd love to spread them to as many schools as we possibly can to teach the next generation not to do what the current generation is doing with this rise of hate and anti-Semitism. Number 3, this is something that you all can do right now. If you have your smartphones handy, you can actually text HEAL to 72572. You'll immediately get a message back to a link that will take you to our website. And if you put in your name, you put in your address, right? We will generate an email to your member of Congress specifically to support what is called the HEALS Act, right? So the Holocaust Education Anti-Semitism Lessons Act. What this HEAL Act will do is essentially, of course, education is mandated at the state level. And there are certain states that do not mandate Holocaust education, some that do. What this bill will do, if passed, will be to recommend to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. to conduct a study to say, nationally, how is America doing in Holocaust education? And hopefully to give recommendations to certain states to say, this isn't being taught properly, or this state doesn't even mandate Holocaust education at all. Hopefully it is the engine at the federal level to work with states to say, we got to do better about educating about the Holocaust. But that's something that you can do right now. It's a bill that's going through Congress right now that ADL is advocating for. Last, please join our newsletter. So we're at ADL Midwest, or follow ADL on social media. There are events that pop up all throughout the year of things we need help with or things that we need help promoting. And then lastly, I handed out a sheet that I see some of you still have in your laps. It's called our 6 simple strategies, right? So one of the things, going back to the base level, I'll go all the way back to here. The vast majority of Americans are not hateful. And even at ADL, right, we see hate groups all the time. I have to remind myself that. But there's a lot of stereotyping. There's a lot of prejudice that still exists in America. And one of the things that every Jewish person can do, I'd argue every American can do, is when you're having conversations with somebody, if somebody says something that's off color, doesn't quite sit well with you, not necessarily hateful, but kind of ignorant, there's a way to counter that, right? And I gave some examples. We call this our 6 simple strategies. When you're in a conversation with somebody and somebody says, Morty, oh, you're Jewish? You don't even look Jewish. I never would have guessed that in a million years. Right? How do you can respond to that? When somebody says, oh, you know, I really need an estate planning attorney or really look into a financial advisor, and somebody would be like, well, make sure they're Jewish. They're the best. Got to get a Jew lawyer. Got to get a Jew banker. They're the best. How do you explain that to people? Right? They don't mean harm when they say that, but it's ignorant. How can you politely respond to that? So those are a couple examples of things you can do in everyday conversations. And if you can imagine the American Jewish community, if we all were doing that with our friends who are non-Jewish or colleagues, can you imagine how less prejudice there would probably be in the United States? Things that Americans just take for granted about facts that really aren't facts about Jewish community. So that's something else that you can do. I wanted to leave that with you as you depart. But like I said, everybody in the Jewish community can do something to help. And if we all do a little small part to stop the stereotyping and to stop the prejudice, we can stop hate in its tracks from working its way up the pyramid. And so with that, I do have business cards on me, but I did want to leave my email address up. If you have additional questions about ADL, if you want to get involved, always happy to respond back. So with that, I want to open up to questions and discussions, and thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Oh, they're going to bring the microphones here with you. Oh, out, Ed. Yeah. Absolutely.
Stamping out Jewish hate.
Oh, there you go. Okay, yeah. It caught on at the last minute there. Yeah, so there is a, so the question was, can you speak to like the little blue square that's been showing up on TV lately, right? So this is actually something that ADL and a number of other Jewish organizations are working together to partner on, which is to bring to light the fact that Jews, even though we make up 2% of the American population, we make up a majority of religious-based hate crimes in the United States. It's been the fact for a number of years, still the case now. So one of the things about the blue square, right? So if you see it on TV, it was something that actually started with Robert Kraft, who is the owner of the New England Patriots. And to his credit, he spent millions and millions of dollars putting these TV ads all across NBC, CBS, ABC. So what you can do is, right, it brings to attention the fact that, you know, there's like, what's that little blue square on the TV? Well, that represents 2% of your screen, which represents the American Jewish population. And people then are shocked to believe that, realize, wow, Jews make up 2% of the American population, yet you make up a majority of religious-based hate crimes, right? Greatly, right, the purport is greatly out of proportion. So that's one movement of bringing attention, light to the non-Jewish community. Also a good way as a conversation, right, for people in the Jewish community to talk with their non-Jewish colleagues or friends to explain when the next anti-Semitic incident hits nationwide, like the Tree of Life massacre, like Colleyville, to explain, wow, how awful that's happening. And to explain to people, well, unfortunately, this has been happening now for the last 5 or 6 years. This is not a new phenomenon. Right? So it's a way to thankfully bring attention to people and try to wake people up to realize that, no, hate's on the rise, and specifically against the Jewish community, it's on the rise too. Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, where are we in terms of anti-Semitism compared to the rest of the world? So ADL, our numbers are a little outdated. The last time we did this survey was in 2019. It's called our Global 100 survey. And by the way, the two reports I shared to you all, this is online. If you go on Google, you can type in anti-Semitic audit, anti-Semitic survey, you can find them on our website. I'd highly also recommend looking at our Global 100 webpage. What's interesting is the numbers come from 2014 and as recently as 2019. And we ask basically the same questions that we ask Americans. We do phone interviews and work with international consultants to ask people, where is the anti-Semitism across the world? And what's interesting is, based on our last results, probably not surprisingly, high levels of anti-Semitism in the Middle East, across Israel. But then you'll see large amounts of anti-Semitism in countries like China. For instance, I think the last time we did the survey, 20% of Chinese individuals that we surveyed believed in like six out of the 11 statements that we asked. China does not have a large Jewish population. Same thing in Brazil. Not a large Jewish population there, but you're seeing relatively high numbers of anti-Semitism, right? So there are certain countries, I gotta admit, like Canada, very low levels of anti-Semitism. Germany, to their credit, they owned up to what the Holocaust took place. They've spent now 2-3 generations educating their public about the Holocaust. And because of that, low levels of anti-Semitism in Germany. But you're seeing it in countries that have large Jewish populations, and similar to the States, you're seeing it in countries that do not have large Jewish populations, because people believe those stereotypes. They believe those prejudices because there's nobody there to counter. Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to 1966. My then husband and I were looking for a house to buy, and we were looking at neighborhoods that were just being built.
Yep.
So we'd go to a development and we'd pick different lots that applied to us, and we were told they were all taken.
Yep.
And eventually they narrowed it down to 2 or 3 lots that we could have. Fast forward to when we all moved in, there were 4 houses on the block, 2 blacks, 2 Jews.
Yeah.
I've lived this story a long time.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. And there was, it's crazy to think it wasn't that long ago when Jews, we were discriminated against and going to certain schools and going to certain universities or living in certain neighborhoods, right? We've overcome that largely, thank goodness. What we are still left to overcome is, okay, well, you can live in my neighborhood and that's fine, but I still think you all are out to take over the world. Or it's like, it's fine, you guys are neighbors, you seem like you're decent people, but I think you guys care more about Israel than you do America. It's those prejudices, it's the bottom base of the pyramid of hate that I was showing you. There's still a lot of stereotyping. There's still a lot of prejudice, right? Thankfully, the acts are still rising, but historically, over a long period of time are not where they were in the 1960s or 70s. But like I said, if we normalize prejudice and if we normalize stereotyping, what's to say that people are not going to take it to the next step to say, well, now I have to act on my anti-Semitism? And it's not a crazy thing to think that, maybe a certain number of years, maybe that next generation, maybe we go back to saying, oh, well, Jews can't live in this neighborhood. Or, Jews, you can go to this school, we really don't want you coming to our school, right? That's why it's so critical about prejudice and bias, checking back, because if you can stop that, you can stop hate from normalizing and continuing. So, thank you for sharing that.
Recently in the news, there's been a lot of I think, anti-Semitism, citing George Soros as supplying monies to various groups, and how do we contest that? I mean, that's been almost every day. There's somebody that's blaming him for different things.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point. It's to that fact of why we're seeing hate rise and people want answers. And that's where conspiracy theories become very popular, because they're super simple to answer. There's nobody there to counter, right? And it doesn't take a long time. You type in conspiracy theories into Google. Try this when you get home. Conspiracy theories, you go a couple of clicks, and I guarantee you, within 3 or 4 clicks, you're going to see something about the global Zionists, you're going to be something about the Jews, something about the Rothschilds family, something about George Soros. And then people latch onto that and say, oh, well, it's their fault, right? And the people are like, no, I'm talking about the global Zionists. And oftentimes, no, that's a dog whistle for Jew. You probably don't realize it, or there are a lot of people who believe those things who really do, and well, I can't say Jews are out. That makes me sound anti-Semitic. I'll just blame George Soros. All right. Part of that is, like I said, working with social media companies. ADL, we've been probably for the last 10 years pushing social media companies, doing everything legally that we can do to go to Meta and to go to Twitter and to go to Facebook and say, stop letting hateful things be posted on your websites. And to be fair, there are certain social media companies that do better than others about removing Holocaust denial content or anti-Semitic content, racist content, but there are others that don't. And that's part of, I think here at ADL, we believe that if you can remove that stuff from social media, especially for young kids, and get that off social media where they're on, hopefully that spread of conspiracy theories and things like that can dwindle. Yeah, it's a long, tough road. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
I want to take issue with your comment about anti-Semitism in China.
Yeah.
I lived in China from 2005 to 2015, completely immersed in the culture. Lived in Shanghai. The Jewish community in Shanghai had an excellent cooperation with the Shanghai government in terms of restoring some of the old Jewish sites. They're very proud of their role in the Holocaust as being a shelter for Jews. There is I would call it positive Semitism.
Yeah.
In terms of there is a fascination in Chinese culture about getting rich as part of this. It's used in the New Year's greetings, for example, Gongxi Fachai, which means get rich.
Right.
And I would often be introduced that this is I hear them in Chinese saying, this is our boss, he's a Yotai Ren, that's a Jew.
Yeah.
And that was a positive attribute. And so they think of us as it's positive that we have some association with money or with Einstein, with intelligence and education. Those values they look on positively. So I don't think your comment about anti-Semitism in China is correct.
Gotcha. No, and I appreciate you pointing that out. And I appreciate you mentioning about positive stereotyping, right? Because I get it, because it's almost endearing if we go to non-Jewish communities and say, well, you guys, as Jews, you guys really do well with money, right? You guys really emphasize education. You all, you do those, and it sounds nice, right? But one of the concepts that we teach at ADL is positive stereotypes can turn negative quickly. Because then it's, as we've seen with recessions or with COVID, or honestly, I would say even like the Holocaust would be an example, right? There were a number of Germans who was like, oh yeah, I got John down the street who's Jewish, great banker, pays his taxes, great guy. It took then a global depression for then Germans. It didn't happen overnight, right? It's a process to where it's like, well, why have I lost my job and why we're in the economy? Well, who controls the economy? Oh, it's the people who can control the money. Who are the people that control the money? Oh yeah, the Jews. And that positive stereotype can then turn negative very quickly. So no, I'm glad that the Chinese look with us on favor, right? But it's one of those things where it just takes one event. It takes one catastrophe for then people to say, that's actually not a positive thing. You all are taking over all the money. Now it turns to hate. So even though it's a positive stereotype, it's still a stereotype nonetheless that can turn negative with one event.
It's a multifaceted problem, I understand.
Yeah.
But I look at our problem as the longest hatred
Yeah.
and where it started. And does ADL take any time working with Christian leaders to perhaps talk about taking one of the Gospels out, that one
Interesting.
that has made the world hate us for our whole lives?
Yeah. Interesting question. So I know we work with, for an example, we do a lot of coalition building, right? So with other marginalized groups, because especially when you're looking at far-right hate groups, rarely do they just hate one group, right? They hate people of color, various sexual orientations, immigrants, things like that. So we try to partner with those groups to say, hey, we were first, they hate us now, you're next, right? Probably would be better to work together to fight against that. But to answer your question about that, I can say that ADL, for instance, Jonathan Greenblatt, our current national director, has met with the Pope, right? We have worked with Catholic churches, we have worked with other churches, to the point of, it still blows my mind, I didn't put it up here as an example, but I think the last time we asked this question, I think it was in 2019, that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. You still have 25% of Americans who agree with that statement. Not recognizing that Jesus himself was Jewish. Now, to be fair, a lot of, I'd say, Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic, major Catholic churches are now embracing Jesus' Jewish role, right, and Jewish roots. But then at the same time, crucifixion was a Roman form of punishment, right? So to answer that question, we haven't done anything like remove this from the gospel or that, but to be fair, there have been numerous popes that have said you can't blame all Jews, right, for what happened to the death of Jesus. You now have other Christian organizations who are now embracing Jesus' Jewish roots, as well as his mother and the disciples and everybody that was involved as well too. That's one thing that I feel like the tide is starting to turn a little bit, but you still have, even though you might have ministers or priests who will say things, people will still leave church and say, well, yeah, the Jews killed Jesus, right? That's a long process, but it's starting to turn, I think.
Thank you for coming.
Absolutely.
I know the organization is doing very well, and I know that we have to be aware, we have to collaborate and go forward. But I think I'm a little bit worried about our Jewish people. You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah.
The problem that I see is, how do we get the Jewish people in general, our community, I'm going to talk about the Milwaukee community, to take part, to accept, to quit hiding their heads in the sand and being afraid to be counted.
Yeah.
And I think this is a problem. Because when you see the turnouts, and this bothers me.
Yeah, no, understandable. And it's one of those, and I get it, especially with older generations who survived the Holocaust, right, or one generation removed. This is not easy information to take in. I get it. I did probably 40 of these presentations last year. I've done 30 so far this year, and I get it. I look at the crowd and I look at some of your faces like this can't be. This sounds really, really depressing, right? It's like, I thought we overcame this. The problem is it's a new generation now, right? Yes, we got past, thank God, we got past the Holocaust. We had more Americans who established, after World War II. There was a lot of Holocaust education, right? You saw lower levels of anti-Semitism taking place, but hate it's a virus. And if left unchecked, and if you don't contain it, you're going to see numbers rise again, right? There's one study, I didn't talk about it here, but there's a study that was done in 2020 looking at millennials and Gen Z generations, so people between the ages of 18 and 30. And the numbers were astounding in terms of the lack of knowledge they had about the Holocaust. Right, I think there was one statistic, if I remember correctly, I think it was 50% of Gen Z and millennials, based on their survey, couldn't name one camp or one ghetto. There were 40,000 that existed in Europe. They couldn't name one. There were a lot of people that were shown photos of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they didn't know what it was. Right? It's one of those things. We did a great job after World War II in addressing these things and really bringing anti-Semitism down. But it's one of those things, if we do not stay active with this, these numbers are going to go back up. So to answer your question, I think it's one of those things where I get it. It's a lot easier to say, well, not my problem. It'll go away. It's fine. I wouldn't take that for granted. And we have to stay vigilant. And we have to teach the next generation about what happened in the Holocaust and explain Jews aren't out to take over the world, right? Don't believe George Soros and Rothschilds and all these other conspiracy theories. If we don't do those things, I bet we're going to see those numbers go back up to maybe where they were in the 1960s. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully I'm wrong. But it's something we have to stay vigilant about. It's hard, I know.
If you take a look in the internet and say, who killed Jesus?
Yep.
It says the Jews.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, and it's that's that's the scary thing. Yeah, like I said, when it comes to social media, when it comes to, you still have ministers, you still have priests. It's not the official version of the Catholic Church or most mainstream like Protestant organizations, but every once in a while you'll still have a minister or a priest, maybe in a small town America, be like, hey, let's talk about the Passion story. Let's talk about how the Jews killed our Lord and Savior. And it's like, no, we didn't. It's been proven over and over and over again, right? But that's why it's important to stay vigilant and to reach communities and multi-faith communities to say, we need you to stand with us and explain to your congregations, like, no, these things that are taken as fact about Jews are not in fact. They are prejudice, that's stereotyping.
In order to fight anti-Semitism, we have to reach the young. How do we do that when books are being banned in libraries?
Yep, absolutely, yep. So I can tell you, ADL, we are certain states that are, to your point, starting to ban books and starting to say, well, these books are too controversial. I can explain this. So before ADL, actually I taught high school history for a year. And I get it. There are a lot of teachers who, especially in public schools, who either don't know how to educate about the Holocaust, right, or ban certain books because it's uncomfortable, because it's controversial. That's the point of education. It's a very hard topic to talk about. It's so easy to say, well, I'll just give the kids a worksheet for the day and then we're going to move on to the 1950s and we'll forget that point. No, you have to talk about hard things, right? And I get it as teachers, either it's not in the standards or teaching to the test or saying, I'm not Jewish myself, I don't even know where to begin about the Holocaust. I get all that. We have a program called Echoes and Reflections. And it's a program that we will train for free educators and give you lesson plans and teach you on how to really educate about the Holocaust for the next generation. But part of that too is in that same vein of hopefully if we try to turn that tide, so to speak, and we start talking about the Holocaust again and really educating, then people will be saying, well, why are we banning these books? Right? Why are we saying we can't teach about the Holocaust? Why are we banning Anne Frank or other books? Exactly. We shouldn't be doing those things. Right? I think it's a level, like I said, of uncomfortableness and uncertainty and controversy. And I don't blame a lot of teachers who say, I don't want to teach this stuff. But we have to. And ADL, we are here to give you as many resources and help as possible to say, like, please teach this to the next generation, because the numbers are very alarming when it comes specifically to Holocaust education. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I just have a question about the workplace and like DEI. Like, what do you recommend for groups like that?
Absolutely. Yep. So over the last, I've been with ADL about 2 years now. I've given 3 or 4 presentations to various companies, and oftentimes people will email us at midwest@adl.org. I am more than happy, and I've done it probably 5 or 6 times now since I've been employed with ADL. If you have a company and they do like a DEI, like Lunch and Learn or something like that, if you're Jewish, if you want your colleagues to learn about Judaism and anti-Semitism, things like that, let me know. I do in-person presentations, I do Zoom presentations, and I do something similar to this, but actually I go into like the basics of Judaism. And one of the things I also go into is understanding the different types of Jews. One of the things, and I can say this, is somebody who I converted to Judaism as an adult. And I stand here in the synagogue and I admit there were prejudices I had about Jews. I was ignorant at one point. And I assumed all Jews looked like Jerry Seinfeld and Barbara Streisand. I can tell you most Americans can't tell you the difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. I go into that and I explain to people, like, not all Jews are white, not all Jews live in New York, or they look like the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. There's a lot of diversity in the Jewish community. And when I see it, and I especially see non-Jews and individuals, they're like, you see the light bulb go off. You know, or I educate them about certain things like where certain anti-Semitic instances came from. And they're like, oh, like, no wonder, like, Jews, it's not that you guys are just magically good with money, it's the fact that in the Middle Ages you all were forced into banking because you couldn't take on other jobs. That makes complete sense now. Blows my mind so many Americans don't know that. All right, so to answer your question about DEI, let me know. I have my card, I will put my email back up. More than happy to give a presentation, definitely on Zoom, or depending on when I'm back in Wisconsin, to do it in person. Happy to do that. And we do it for free, by the way. Yeah.
Can you comment on the pyramid? You put up the pyramid earlier in your presentation.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned earlier restricted covenants, which means that Jews could be restricted on a municipal level, but there are also others, and the other is being discriminated all around the country. So where are we when it comes to state-sanctioned efforts, when somebody talked about book banning by states and anti-LGBTQ. So where are we? How far up is United States in the pyramid? Not necessarily for us. I think we're maybe
various other people.
at the baseline.
Absolutely. I mean, there are still. We talk about people of color, people of various sexual orientations. I mean, you could argue, like, you still see violence take place against people who are gay or bisexual or transgender, right? There still is, even though it is no longer government sanctioned as it was up until the 1960s, 1970s, there's still neighborhoods where somebody who's African American or somebody who's an immigrant moves into, and you still have cases, and I'm not an expert about real estate law or things like that, but you'll still have realtors say, no, you don't want to move into this neighborhood, it doesn't fit really well, how about we do this, right? So there's still examples, even though it's not state-sponsored like it was in the 20th century, you still have prejudice and you still have stereotyping, and it's very subtle. Yeah. Yeah. I would argue, yeah. I mean, what happened with President Trump's Muslim ban that he made in 2017 is a perfect example, all right? And it's an example of how subtle it becomes, right? The scary part about this pyramid is that it's not like there's a news like, oh, we've moved one level up the pyramid, right? We're moving up two levels of the pyramid. It happens very subtly and very calmly. One of the things, especially when I speak to non-Jewish audiences, when we talk about the Holocaust, is Hitler didn't come to power in 1933 and the Holocaust started that next day. There was a multi-year process of working their way up and saying, what can we get away with, right? We know there's a lot of prejudice in Germany. Okay, well, we'll see if we can do acts of prejudice. Let's see if we can get away with Kristallnacht and the pogrom. Let's see if we can get away with refusing Jews to live in certain neighborhoods or certain jobs. And as the Nazis continued to kind of work their way up, they were like, well, if we can get away with this, I think we can get away with genocide too. And it wasn't just Nazi Germany. The 20th century was a perfect example of multiple genocides of it took years. And the foundation was still laid there. That's why we really emphasize that you can stop stereotyping and prejudice right at the base level. You can stop hate in its tracks. Yeah.
So I go to Cedarburg School District at Webster Middle School, and I'm one of two Jewish kids that is part of their community, and I have faced multiple acts of anti-Semitism personally, and there's this one person in my grade that has said multiple things to me and is pretty much targeting me now, just making fun of me and practically bullying me. Just, I think it's from me being Jewish, but it's more things that are just annoying and he's just being rude.
Yep.
And there have been multiple other acts, and I know in other grades there have been acts of anti-Semitism, and it's scary when you go to a middle school and you're already facing that.
Yep.
But like, you can't imagine what's going to happen in high school or college.
Yep. And it's one of those, and I thank you for sharing that with me, and I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. And unfortunately, there are millions, at least thousands of Jewish students who at the middle school level, high school level, especially when you get to college, I'd argue when you get to college, it becomes more about anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, still a form of anti-Semitism, we agree, at ADL. But there are ways to counteract that, whether it's talking to teachers, talking to counselors. If schools are not listening, right, talk with staff here at your congregation. If they're still not listening, right, talk to your parents, talk with ADL. One of the things we can't force, right, because we're not the police, right, we're not law enforcement, we can't force schools to implement our programming, but it's oftentimes when, give an example, there is a school district in northwestern Illinois that multiple schools have had incidences of anti-Semitism and hate and things like that. Then when that happens, then schools are wondering, well, what do we do about it? ADL will come in. We have our programming. We have our anti-hate program. We have our anti-bias programming. You don't have to recreate the wheel. ADL has done it. Right? So when those things happen to you, right, like I said, going to authorities, right, going to your synagogue, right, having your parents report to ADL, right, and continue to fight that and continue to counter it. Because what happens is if that person continues to say those things, there's nobody there to educate that person. The other way, they're going to keep believing those things, right?
There is a school in central Wisconsin near Wausau, a school system, and I can't remember the exact name of the school system, but they're near Wausau. They put out a project, a social studies project, about every 4 or 5 years. And somehow they found my mom. My mom was a Holocaust survivor. She spent 13 months in Auschwitz, and she survived. And they found her through the Holocaust Museum. And unfortunately, she had passed away right before, they found her. And they contacted me. There was a letter that came to her apartment, and I received the letter, and they actually interviewed me. They did their subject matter for that particular year was the Holocaust. And it really, I thought, was a wonderful project. The 8th graders were the ones who did the calling and interviewed the Holocaust survivors, or me as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And then the seniors wrote the book. They took are you aware, is ADL aware of that program that goes on? They've done programs on the Hmong people who've moved to this country, and a number of other projects. I don't know if you're aware of that, but this happened, what, about 4 or 5 years ago? Oh, more than that, I think. It was when we had my mother's unveiling shortly around the time I was interviewed, so it was about 9 years ago.
Yeah.
So this to me was a wonderful thing, because this is small town Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Doing a program like this, these kind of things would be wonderful to see spread all over this country.
I completely agree. No, thank you for sharing that with me. I wasn't familiar with that case. I wouldn't be surprised for our education team, because they work a lot in Wisconsin as well too. I wouldn't be shocked if they were familiar with that, but that's one example of, it doesn't just have to be ADL. I know I'm speaking as an ADL representative, but that's an example of people who, either in the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community, all saying, probably on that teacher or that school to say, no, we're going to educate about this because it's important. One of the things that ADL is doing is, through the HEAL Act or working in various states, there are still, so as of right now, there are 25 states that mandate Holocaust education. There are 4 states that are pending legislation. So there's still 28 states that don't mandate Holocaust education. That's why ADL, we're so critical about bringing legislation, working with JCRCs, working with federations to say, let's make sure it's mandated, let's make sure it's on the books. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's the first step, right? And I thank you for sharing that story, because I wish that were the case across the entire United States. There are some school districts that do really well educating about it. There are some that, here's this worksheet, right? Work on it. We'll talk about it later tomorrow, and then we'll move on. It's one of those things, like, it has to be really commonplace. And it's all of us in the Jewish community doing something to make sure that the Holocaust is being taught for that next generation. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Well, I started with 1966, and now I'm going to go to recent years.
Yep.
What we're avoiding in this discussion is that Jews are scapegoats.
Yep.
When the MAGA people came into power and the government of this country promoted hate, and they did, not just us, anybody, but we were the chosen people. That was not intentionally a joke, but we've been calling ourselves the chosen people, and now we are. We are the people that they're picking on. And this rise in anti-Semitism has in very large measure been a result of those 4 years, and the 2 years since, because the followers haven't stopped following.
Yep.
It's very hard to eliminate hate.
Yep.
And so what we have to do is make them like us. And I don't know exactly how to do that. I know what I do. I have a friend who's black. I have a best friend who just passed away, 30 years Lutheran minister. I go out there, I'm a former New Yorker, so that explains my story. I'm out there meeting people of every possible dimension that there is. Unfortunately, in a lot of smaller communities, this one being one of them, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
People stay with their own kind. And my encouragement is diversify.
Yep.
And get out and meet other people and talk about what they are thinking and what you are thinking, and maybe you can come to some common ground.
Yep. Absolutely. No, and I think you touch on, I think this is where I think synagogues right, can partner. I'm sure Shalom has done something like this, where like holding multi-faith seders or holding multi-faith meetings, right? JCRCs do this as well too. Part of like going back to the pyramid of hate, right? To stop it dead in its tracks is to stop stereotyping and prejudice. And one of the ways that you do that is to educate people and talk to people. So one program that JCRC, and I think in Milwaukee they do it as well too, it's called Student to Student, and it is a brilliant program. They take high school, Jewish high school students, they send them across the area, and it's high schoolers talking to high schoolers. And they educate about what it means to be Jewish. What is this holiday all about, right? What do Jews believe about this? What's that? And it's amazing, because as a former teacher, right, like to believe my kids listened to me every single minute when I was giving a lecture. Of course they weren't, right? But when you have high schoolers talking to high schoolers, right, you take that next generation and say, oh, I guess Jews aren't that different. I guess they really aren't the other, right? It's like, oh, I'm a Chicago Bears fan, but I know I'm in Wisconsin. It's like, oh, you're a Green Bay Packers fan? Right? Oh, I am too. Right, can you believe what this happened and that happened? When you build commonality with people and you realize, oh, like, yeah, we might be different religions or different races, right? But it's like, oh, we actually have a lot in common, right? You're not as scary as I thought you were. Well.
This might be the first time there's ever been two Bears fans on the BMO with no
I know,
Packers fans, so it's a very unique situation here. If anyone did not get this handout, we made more copies of it. They're sitting on the cart in the back on your way out. So if you need those 6 strategies for how to respond to anti-Semitism, that is there. 7th graders, we're going to be back in your class 2 minutes after we break from here. But I want to thank Trent for being here, for sharing all of this with us and giving us things to think about. Thank you. I think if you have any more questions, you're probably here for a little
I'll still
bit.
be here. Yep.
But looks like the sun came out, so let's take advantage of that weather a little bit more. 7th grade, 2 minutes back in your classroom, take a quick break, and then we'll meet.